thank you for joining us and allowing us to come here to MoMA, Queens. It's especially appropriate that we're talking about two of the great painters of the 20th century, and we're talking with the former chief curator of painting and sculpture of 20th century painting at MoMA, which has the most extraordinary collection, and his successor. So John, congratulations for taking over. And this has been a labor of love for the two of you for what, 6 years?
Yep, yes. About 6 years, yeah.
How did it begin?
I suppose it goes back to the Matisse exhibition, which I did in 1992. And at the end of that, since there were so many pictures in that exhibition and the deinstallation time was going to take so long, we made a decision that we would bring up into the galleries some of the museum's Picassos and see what Cubist works by Matisse and Picasso looked like together. And one of the great pairings made possible then was the museum's own Demoiselle d'Avignon and the great Matisse Bathers with the Turtle.
And you were looking for what, John?
It became evident, looking in that exhibition at the spread of Matisse's art, that the Cubist moment was very important indeed, and I think had probably been underestimated in earlier accounts of Matisse's art. And this was a way of testing it. It was a way of saying, okay, if this is so important, what will it look like with some great Cubist works by Picasso?
And what did it look like, Kirk?
Well, it looked fantastic. It was a word-of-mouth exhibition. It only lasted 2 weeks, but scholars came from all over the world to see these pictures in juxtaposition with each other, and suddenly the idea began to grow amongst everybody who saw that show. This is something new to think about. You can't imagine how Picasso and Matisse had been taught separately in all art history courses. There'd been very little thinking up to that point about their interaction. They were two great titans, and one recognized that they were planetary forces in the constellation of 20th century art. But the specifics of the way they bounced off each other only became clear in this small section that John put up, and everybody started wanting more. And I think particularly the British scholar John Golding, who'd known John Elderfield for a long time, and his colleague Lizzie Cowling were bitten by the bug and went back home and started conjuring a much, much bigger exhibition on the same theme.
So you've got the Tate already.
Yeah, we had the Tate, and as we started to meet with the Tate and talk about what we needed, it was clear that we needed the French as well, both the Centre Pompidou, their great collections of Matisse and Picasso, and also the Musée Picasso. And therefore, it inevitably became a three-city institution, and it soon became a six-curator proposal.
And a 6-year project.
And a 6-year project.
Tell me what it signifies. What's the significance of this exhibition, Matisse Picasso, that was seen at the Tate, then at the Grand Palais, and now at MoMA, Queens?
Well, I think the first thing is what Kirk just said, that these artists had so often been thought of separately, and he was a chance to see how, in fact, the workings of early modern art actually happened in practice, not in terms of artists viewed separately, but in terms of a process. And a process, in this case, of these two people, the preeminent artists of their time, looking at each other, feeling jealous of each other, feeling they could learn from each other. And I think that as we, the curators, worked on it, we realized we were dealing with what effectively was a sort of laboratory of modernism being created.
Yeah, but when you went looking, you're not looking for just the best Matisse and the best Picasso. You're looking for connection.
We're looking for dialogues, and especially dialogues that happen on equal terms. We're not trying to put together a slideshow of a little image and a big image. We wanted pictures that had the same force, the same level of quality, where the artists met each other from a point of strength, and where the dialogue between the two pictures was truly not just something superficial in the way of borrowing, but in the way of a real engagement with the work of the other. I think one of the significances of the show is for anyone in culture who is interested in the idea of influence or the idea of dialogue, how a great experiment happens between two people, not just between one person, and how sometimes the dialogue between two people is about a third person. Often the two pictures we put together are both talking about Cézanne or having a conversation between themselves about Delacroix or about Ingres.
They're speaking to their what Cézanne means to them or what he influences them in their separate paintings. That's the point.
Yes, often when you get a comparison between the two painters, even their two self-portraits at the beginning of the exhibition, both of them are referring to Cézanne, but to a different understanding of Cézanne. And each of them is watching the other for the other's interpretation of the masters that they respect together. And the same thing happens with Ingres, and the same thing happens with Delacroix. So often it's a kind of three-way conversation, these two people conversing with the tradition.
Whenever you put together a big exhibit, both of you put together big exhibits, one is the collection of the paintings. What's missing here that you wanted?
We were amazingly successful.
I should be talking about what's here rather than what's not here.
What's not here? There are a few things which can't be here.
They can't travel.
Yeah. The Bonheur de Vivre from the Barnes Foundation, which never lends its pictures. There were occasional other things. There were a couple of works in private collections which had changed hands recently, and the owners didn't want to lend them. As we put together our pairs and groupings, it became critically important, of course, that we had, if it was a pair, both pictures. And we realized that we may be able to get picture A, but if we didn't get picture B, we would have to give up picture A. And this made it a far more complex undertaking than usual.
And how is MoMA Queens different from Tate and Grand Palais?
As this is a big industrial building that we install the exhibition in here, it had an extremely broad column bay, had very high ceilings, and we had the luxury of building the walls tailor-made to the structure of the show, whereas neither of the other venues had the same flexibility and liberty that we had. So we feel we're able to build more open spaces to accommodate the crowds. At the same time, we parceled out the units of the show more exactly, perhaps.
So you're saying Queens MoMA, which is a temporary facility, while MoMA is under construction and renovation and architectural design, this may have enabled you to do things you might not have been able to do at the main building?
On the old MoMA of 53rd Street, I don't think we could have done an installation that was as open, as spacious, as complex as this one. In the new MoMA that Taniguchi is designing, we'll have a whole new world.
This notion of Picasso and Matisse, the connection, when did it begin?
It began really when they met. I mean, before that point, they'd been looking at each other's work and were aware of each other. Picasso especially was aware that Matisse was the person to beat, the person to equal.
And he was after 12 years older than Picasso.
Yeah. Matisse was older, he was established. By the time that Picasso met him, Matisse, in 1906, Matisse had achieved the reputation as the leader of the avant-garde. And Picasso was this young kid from Spain who didn't speak French very well, who had to listen while Matisse talked and theorized. And you sense in the early pictures that, the level of ambition in Picasso as he's catching up. And, of course, he catches up in 1907 with the Demoiselle. And at that point...
Catches up means what here, John?
It means creating a work of extraordinary ambition where Matisse has to start to look at Picasso, and it becomes really a dialogue.
They met at Gertrude Stein's house?
They were introduced by the Steins, apparently. The Steins were collecting both of them. And so one of the reasons they were aware of each other was they knew that they shared this patronage. So from the beginning, there was this kind of competition. And the Steins ran a kind of salon. And as John has alluded to, Picasso didn't speak French all that well, and Matisse was a real social mover. As the older man, he was more professorial, he had a beard, he liked to expound. There's a wonderful comment by one of the Steins analyzing the two of them that said that Matisse was social but not congenial, and Picasso was congenial but not social. Picasso had an innate charisma, but when you were close to him and the people around him really magnetically attracted people, but he was not very good at the social graces and uncomfortable and bored in salon situations where Matisse really knew how to work the room.
And there was also the sort of bohemian quality that you were referring to about, and there was a kind of genteelness about Matisse.
About Matisse, yeah. I mean, Picasso made himself into the first celebrity artist. Although Matisse was, had great social graces, there was something about the charisma of Picasso and the way in which he projected his personality that, he was a media star. I mean, and Matisse was not like this at all. And there's a great story how, probably in the 1930s, Matisse goes into a restaurant in Paris, I think La Coupole, and people get up and applaud. And Matisse, turns to a companion and says, "Oh, they must think it's Picasso." and it's an interesting comment because he's pleased that people recognize him. He's pleased that artists now are recognized, but at the same time, he's irritated that it's necessary to do this in artistic practice.
Talk to me more about the difference in the personality of these two guys, because they, their sense of art was different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we get a picture of that here, but you also see what this is about, the similarities and where they connect.
There's a comment made by, I think it's Picasso, said that if you looked at what we're doing, we look so different, but actually we're doing the same thing by different means. So I think they both recognized when they were on the same tracks. But it's easy to see in retrospect that some of the great cliches about their differences need to be inverted, that for their artistic personalities, one always thinks of Matisse as the more lyrical, the more light, the more decorative, and that Picasso is the more structural, the more trenchant, the more aggressive. But there are many paintings in this exhibition where Matisse is far more tectonic, monumental, where the pictures are scraped and done with a toughness that makes the Picasso beside it seem delicate, miniaturized, lyrical.
But there is some who say Picasso's been shortchanged by the exhibition because of just that fact. You see a new Matisse for some people, and Picasso, they say, suffers from that. You've heard this before.
Well, I think that you see a different Picasso. You see, at times, as Kirk says, actually a very delicate Picasso. You see aspects of Picasso's personality which the legend hasn't normally allowed to come to the fore. The great 1909 Bather painting, which Louis Smith gave to MoMA, is delicately painted with a tiny brush. Yeah. And it's something which you don't think about when you see it in its context. Here, you see it against a rougher Matisse, and you think, what an amazing picture. This kind of delicacy, every inch of the surface filled. I don't think Picasso suffers from that.
In fact, you also said earlier that we didn't pick all the greatest works by both artists. Think Matisse's Dance from Russia is not here, the great Conversation from the Hermitage. There are many terrific Matisses which would have made him look stronger, which are omitted from the exhibition too. The show is about the moments of dialogue, and some of Picasso's greatest moments, particularly in analytic cubism, are moments with which Matisse had no communication, and so they're omitted from the exhibition.
Well, let me just go back to this time. Most of this is between 1906 and 1915, isn't it? 16?
One of the great moments of the career is there, but this is a dialogue that goes on until after Matisse dies. The whole show
and Picasso
covers into...
continues to remember.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And interesting, I think neither of us had realized it was like this until we saw it installed, but I now think of it as two big movements. The first one is Picasso catching up, the whole Cubist episode through 1917, where then Matisse has to catch up and come to terms with Cubism. And then there's a lull, they're apart, and then the second big movement is in the 1930s, where this time it's Picasso who appropriates Matisse's manner, and Matisse has to catch up with somebody painting his own pictures almost.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting you say that, John, catch up, because a lot of people want to look at this almost as a sports metaphor, that this is a race for greatness. These are the titans of modern art in the 20th century, and we're going to come here and see what you two put on the wall, and we're going to decide who between them is the greatest. Is it Matisse? Is it Picasso?
But the really curious thing is that in 5 or 6 years of working on this exhibition, among the 6 curators meeting 3 times a year, the one question we never asked ourselves was who wins in this game. We never thought of it as a competition in that sense.
You promised me. You've never thought about this question. It's like a parlor game. Who is the greatest artist of the 20th century? I think everybody, 90% of the people, believe it's either Matisse or Picasso.
We think it's Matisse Picasso.
You think it's Matisse and you think it's Picasso.
Wouldn't it be an enormously...
No,
not true. I will say this, that in the course of working on the exhibition, I think I started out a Picasso person. I don't think Picasso's come down a whit but I feel I've gained a much greater respect for and understanding of Matisse.
And I think that is the conventional, that is the majority opinion of people who come here, that very thing. You gain an appreciation. Interesting point. You learn from putting an exhibition like this together. You, who've had this distinguished position at MoMA and are well known as a curator, an historian, and a lecturer, come to new ideas and insights about Picasso, and especially Matisse. What did you learn about Matisse?
Well, one of the things is that an exhibition does things you can't do through books, you can't do through any other form of learning. When you bring two works of art into juxtaposition with each other, things that don't translate in reproductions, things that can't be learned by seeing one of them in Russia and the other one in Los Angeles, happen. And that's the joy of being a curator, that's the joy of coming to see an exhibition. That's why we go to all the trouble of doing it. And so after 5 years of working with this, when we stood on the floor and the works came in together, suddenly we saw cross-references we hadn't thought about before. We saw things in the pictures, the shape of an arm, the tilt of a head, the way that eyes were done, the power of a picture, its surface, the way it was finished or unfinished. These are things which you can only apprehend sensually in the presence of the originals. And that's why it was a thrill for both of us, even after 5 or 6 years of work and after seeing the show in 2 other places, to do the installation together and to talk to each other about all the new things, even in the course of the installation, that we discovered.
All right, let me raise a couple of questions about this. How they view different things and how they led a different life, which is sort of throughout this. Because, for example, Matisse always worked with a model most of the time, did he not?
Yep, he did. Yep.
Picasso,
Working from the imagination.
and mainly about his wives or his lovers.
Yeah, well, in general, he worked from the imagination and invented fictional characters, many of whom we now identify with specific people like his lovers.
Yeah. Color. Matisse was the best.
Yes,
Colorist.
he was, and he had instinctive gifts about color. One thing the exhibition demonstrates is there's a lot of great Matisses which aren't highly colored, and there's a lot of great Picassos which are highly colored.
One conventional wisdom that goes away,
that really
that you
goes
understood
away.
that they each was better, that are different than you
Although
imagined.
I do think how they understand color is very different. And, this is also one of the things which perhaps we knew but is confirmed.
How is it different?
I think that Picasso had a more nominative notion about color. He had an idea of colors as named things, which this is green, this is purple, this is pink. With Matisse, I don't think it was like this. I think that he started working on paintings and then invented the color combinations as they went along.
I think Picasso had symbolic associations with color, fairly traditional ones: blood, red, fertility, heat, orange for lust, for the idea. But he also, the colors of the Spanish flag. When he wanted to personalize things, he would impose the colors of the Spanish flag, the colors of a harlequin's costume with which he identified with himself. He often had superstitious or symbolic associations with things rather than simply the optical pleasure of seeing them mixed on the canvas.
How did they respectively view Cubism?
Well, I think that Picasso is clearly the inventor, along with Braque, of the style of Cubism. And when Matisse first saw it, he thought it was the most alien thing to everything he wanted to achieve. You have to realize that in 1989, what Matisse was pushing was a line of liberated color. And suddenly here are Picasso and Braque bleeding the color out of pictures, going back to a kind of monochrome brown. And Matisse wanted a kind of liberated, organic, splashy looseness. And here's a strict, hierarchical geometry. He thought it was nothing he could ever deal with. But when Picasso and Braque began to move out of the dissolved, more atmospheric world of analytic cubism into a tectonics of line and isolated shape and flat panels in what's called synthetic cubism, say around 1912-13, then Matisse recognized a vocabulary of openness and a kind of open-span iron architecture with simple bowl shapes that could lead him to new kinds of paintings. And then he wrestled with it and decided he was going to have to contend with it. It's interesting, I think, that he has a foothold in Picasso's work in the immediately proto-cubist works, that he sees something he can deal with in the kind of primitivizing works, and in the works that come out in 1912. But there's a period in the middle where he not only is temperamentally alienated by Cubism, he doesn't see anything in it he can use. Then when Picasso shifts styles, he says, I can use this, and then he begins to make it his own.
Surrealism. They had different ideas about it. Surrealism.
They had very different ideas. And
Picasso was a kind of
yeah. I mean, Picasso
founder.
was adopted by
Right.
the Surrealists, and the very aggressive mode of his paintings, particularly in terms of female representations, was something which the Surrealists could absolutely hang on to. And it was such a different world to, you know, Matisse's odalisques, his sort of make-believe
right,
harems
right.
and so on. And also, Matisse had this idea that Surrealism was about puns and thought it was too literary. And he was thinking, you know, less of Miro, whose work he liked, but more of Dali and Magritte, and artists of that kind. And he thought this was a throwback to old illustrative painting. And of course, it was only part of Surrealism. In the end, of course, Picasso produced this strange mixture of Surrealism and Matisse in the 1930s. And by doing this, he pushed a kind of colourful Matisseian style in a direction which Matisse could never have pushed it, and forced Matisse to sit up and pay attention. And I do think that what Matisse did in the later 30s, for me, unquestionably is affected by Picasso, and therefore has a certain surrealist quotient in it, which could never have come in any other way. And I think as often we find not only that each artist is pushing the other, but neither would have been as great and as adventurous without the other.
You're shaking your head, nodding in agreement.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, one of the great lessons is that each artist taught the other to be himself in some ways. The Demoiselle d'Avignon is a picture that was goaded by Matisse, but in directions Matisse would never have gone.
Did he see it? I don't remember the story.
He certainly saw it. Matisse saw it in the studio.
In the studio
Yeah.
before Picasso completed it.
Yes, and Picasso didn't exhibit it until 1917. It was a kind of legend.
And in 1907 is when he painted it.
Yeah, and he was goaded by the blue nude, which he'd seen in the spring of 1907, and I think Matisse pushed him beyond the envelope of the Western tradition into tribal art in a more aggressive fashion. And then seeing the Demoiselle...
Wait, Matisse pushed him?
Matisse pushed Picasso by his desire, by Picasso's desire to best the kind of roughness and savagery of the blue nude. He reached further than he might otherwise have reached for something even double savage and more aggressive and more transgressive than what Matisse had done. And when Matisse saw the Demoiselle, what it did was push him back deeper into the Western tradition, back to Giotto, back to the so-called Italian primitives, that he regrounded himself. If the blue nude is based on Michelangelo and the figures on the Medici tombs, the bathers with the turtle, which is his response to the Demoiselle, goes further back in Italian painting to Giotto. So that, in a sense, Matisse pushed Picasso in that direction, and Picasso pushed Matisse in this direction, and they became more themselves by virtue of the challenge with the other. And I think that's one of the more interesting things that you see happening throughout the show, is that that happens, they polarize each other, and then sometimes, as John has outlined, Picasso will, for example, get a hold of Matisse's odalisques, do something with them that Matisse himself hasn't done, and force Matisse to remake his style, because Picasso has become more Matissean than Matisse.
There's a great quote from Picasso, who, after Matisse died, I think. What was it, John?
It was,
Matisse...
he says that Matisse left me his odalisques as a legacy. And indeed, right after Matisse's death, it's when Picasso begins this famous sequence of variations on Delacroix's work, which again is, the work being mediated by another artist. But in terms of what Kirk was saying, I think there's the other thing, which is the sensibility and the temperament. That Matisse was a slow developing artist. He wasn't naturally gifted. He was, in fact, rather clumsy as an artist.
And in fact, he got a late start. I mean, it was
got a
only
late
after he went to
start.
law school
Yeah.
and when he was in his 20s that he turned to art after he got sick.
Exactly. Picasso was a quick learner, he started quickly and was enormously gifted, a great virtuoso. And I think that Matisse helped Picasso to realize that virtuosity wasn't going to be enough in the 20th century. And Picasso taught Matisse that virtuosity could help. And I think that in that sense, it's a very interesting how they were working off of each other in that way as well.
Continuing this idea of both contrasting comparisons, how they were like and how they were different, how they influenced each other, Picasso was much more autobiographical.
Well, we tend to think that because what John said earlier, he made so much of himself as a celebrity artist. And for years now, people have tried to date his different periods by his different mistresses. And you have a feeling that his art fed off of his autobiography. But if you look at Matisse's work, if you look at the piano lesson, the Red Studio, his early paintings of his family, the amazing portrait of his wife, the later portraits of Lydia, the different models that he had, in some ways his work is quite autobiographical. It's just that he was so private about his life, that so little was known and he let so little out about it. He didn't want to be a public
social
figure.
Animal.
He wasn't a public. He was a social person with people he thought were important to himself, patrons, other artists that he liked, but he wasn't a public person in the way that Picasso knew how to play the media, he knew how to court writers, and the people who've written about him since have made a great deal out of the way he lived in public, and all of the famous breakup of his marriage with Olga and then the Marie-Thérèse incident. Well, in fact, the breakup of Matisse's marriage and the advent of new models is just as clear in his work. If you look at it, it's not as publicly known. Matisse was a much more private person. I think there's a lot that's deeply felt and autobiographical in Matisse's work that's not been recognized.
Do we get this here, or is this something we just know about
I think it's something we're beginning to discover now with new, more probing investigations into Matisse's life.
Sex.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the interesting things in the show, and I'm sure John would say something about this as well, is the way that Matisse seems, in Matisse's art in general, he talked about his art being an art of consolation, being an art of repose for the mental worker. And there's certain territories he doesn't want to go into. So sex for him is often an issue of pleasure, an issue of lyricism, an issue of relaxation, whereas sex often for Picasso is a moment of extreme tension, anxiety, aggression, rage, deformation, misogyny, etc.
But what does that say about the two of them, both in personal terms and in artistic terms?
Well, Matisse had a certain kind of governor on his art. He had a set of limits where he didn't want his work to go. He believed it was the purpose of art to have a certain effect on the viewer. He wanted to transform the world. Remember Van Gogh talked about he wanted art to be consoling. Matisse had some sense that art did not want to be about deformation. It did not want to be about the ugly and twisted. It did not want to raise deep anxieties. And Picasso wanted his art to do these things.
Because he believed art should...
Partly,
John.
Also, he talks about wanting possession. He says drawing is a way of possessing the object. Matisse says drawing is a way of getting inside the model. And it's different. I mean, for Matisse, it was a sense of empathy that he wanted. And, in that sense, he identifying himself with the model means somehow that the model's otherness sexually, in a sense, is effaced by this because the model and Matisse have become one person. With Picasso, the model is always another person who should be seen to be separate and to be seen to be possessed. I mean, it's a very different kind of thing. And it's complicated, of course, when one thinks of how these works were created, that it's Matisse who was sitting in front of the often naked model. And we know from photographs that he liked to work from absolute proximity, nearer than we are sitting. I mean, right up to the model he would work. Yeah. Picasso, the model isn't there. So the model and the sex is in the head.
Also, I would add to that, I mean, the cliched observation, but a grain of stereotypes always have a grain of truth. Picasso was Spanish, and there's a Spanishness to Picasso's art, which is not there in Matisse's work. And often critics polarized this and made Matisse the paradigmatic embodiment of French harmony, lucidity, etc., whereas Picasso was the extremist, the foreigner who dealt in tragedy and passion in a more grotesque fashion. But there is some element that Picasso links back to Goya, links back to a Spanish tradition of more dark and light drama.
Yeah, and I think also in that contrast, we have to remember that Matisse's France is not the France of Descartes. Yeah. There's a bit of it in it, but Matisse is from the very north. I mean, he was born nearer to Brussels than to Paris.
Right.
And in in the 17th century, he would have been a Flemish painter, not a French painter.
Yeah, I don't think, did he come to Paris when he was about 20 or 19 or 20?
So I mean, he's really a person of the far north.
Did they look at faces differently, how they painted faces, or not?
I think you only have to look at the group of portraits that we put together to see how differently they conceive, for example, the very similar subject of the mask, and the mask as a surrogate for the face. They both, at a certain moment, begin to think of painting faces like masks, but they take very different ideas of what the mask means psychologically and in the way it's manipulated in presenting the face. I think that, Picasso often is splitting faces, wrenching one half for the other, doubling eyes on the other side of the face in a way that Matisse wouldn't.
They knew each other, 1905, 1906, met through the Gertrude Stein and her family. They exchanged paintings.
Yep.
What did they exchange, John?
I mean, very soon after they met, they exchanged paintings. And how they did this is still something of a mystery. And there's been a lot of controversy about why they choose particular
that was what I'm
pictures.
getting at.
Yeah. And Picasso chose, or was offered, a small portrait, very childlike, of Matisse's daughter Marguerite. It's been said that he chose it because he thought it was terrible, and certainly the people around Picasso encouraged that belief. And there's stories that they threw darts at it in the studio. There aren't any dart holes on the painting, of course. Matisse chose a very rough still life by Picasso. And, again, thinking of what Kirk was saying earlier about the roughness versus of Matisse generally, and the more refined qualities of Picasso, it is interesting that Matisse chooses a Picasso which has some of the quality of his own painting, and Picasso chooses a very simplified portrait which reminds one of the simplification in his own paintings of the period. And we've hung them in the exhibition next to self-portraits of 1906 by the two artists. And I think if you look at these, you think, well, actually, the Picasso self-portrait has quite a bit in common with the Matisse that he chose for its simplification. And similarly, the Matisse self-portrait has quite a lot in common with the self-portrait by Picasso he chose for its crudity.
I want to come back to how you chose to begin with the portraits and what you chose to end with and the influence of the cutouts on Picasso's sculpture and all of that. But let me just stay with this notion. How much did they see each other? I mean, they weren't fast friends. They were different personalities, different temperaments, different ages, different styles.
Yeah. There were certain periods when they saw a lot of each other.
In Paris.
In Paris. And interestingly, if you think of the two great political events of their lifetime are two world wars. And both of these things were things that brought them together. During World War I, Picasso was in Paris, not fighting, of course, because of being Spanish. Matisse had volunteered but wasn't accepted. So they are together. Many of their friends are not. That particularly brought them together. They went horse riding together. Yeah. In the time of the Second World War, when Matisse, in fact, was about to leave the country, he ran into Picasso. And coincidentally, the Germans are invading France. And Picasso says to Matisse, oh, it's the same idiots who ran the École des Beaux-Arts. And they effectively made a pact that they wouldn't leave the country. And in the years after World War II, they became close. And part of the reason is that they had this great fellow feeling during these periods of wartime.
Okay, but part of the reason was geography, too. And I mean, during the war, Matisse leaves, Picasso stays in Paris, and they don't see each other during the war.
Matisse goes to the south of France, which is where he normally lives, and Picasso's in Paris. But in fact, Matisse writes him, asks Picasso to look out after his paintings that are stored in a bank vault. They're in close communication by letter during the war. And then after the war, Picasso begins to spend much more time in the south of France, and that's when they begin to see each other on a very regular basis from the late 40s through to
Is the relationship much better then? I mean, have they come to settle into a kind of friendship or not?
Yes, there's still the same sense of suspicion.
Competition?
Yeah, competition
Suspicion?
and suspicion. There was one of the few earlier Matisse Picasso exhibitions that happened was one that happened in London just after the war. And in the research for this exhibition, turned up this wonderful letter from Matisse, who's worried about this and saying, I think I'm going to be showing with an epileptic. You know, he thinks that, you know, people are going to think that Picasso's crazy, and why is he showing with this person, you know? And, you know, there's...
And what was the response to that exhibition in 47?
I think that a lot of people, I mean, this was England. I can say this because I come from England. You know, England in the period after the war was, you know, hardly sympathetic towards modern art. And I think people, in fact, thought both of them were mad.
Matisse wrote a letter to Gertrude Stein, critical of Picasso and saying he's a bandit. I don't want to see him.
Many artists said Picasso was a bandit. Picasso was such a quick study. You know, he could seize something and get to the heart of it in a minute. And often, I think it was Giacometti who said, he doesn't look at my studio with two eyes, he looks with two cameras. I don't want to let him in the door. There was many an artist who felt that whatever they were doing, they'd see on Picasso's easel the next day, that he was a very quick magpie to pick things up. But the converse is also true, that Picasso moved through things so fast that he touched on things for a month or a week that for other artists they could mine for a career. So he gave back quite as much as he took, I think.
Do you think they realized, both of them, their greatness, and that they were defining art?
Absolutely.
No doubt about it.
I mean, now think of it, it may seem to be an extraordinary egotism or an extraordinary self-knowledge, you know. And I mean, you know, it was clear that they were defining art from 1906 through to mid-century. The first half of the 20th century is dominated by these two artists more than any others. Current spin off them, you know, one can certainly argue very plausibly, and both Kirk and I would argue for the greatness of Mondrian, of Malevich, of Miro, and so on and so forth. But in a way, these two are the fountainhead of it all. And they knew it. And towards the end of their life, they talk about the great chain of art. And the artists they had admired, and they see themselves in this chain. And they say, you know, when one of us dies, a link in the chain is gone. And it's Picasso who says, I think, you know, if you die, I'll have nobody to talk to.
Exactly. And he also said, Picasso said, to grasp 20th century art, you ought to see side by side everything Matisse and I were doing. Talking about comparisons and similarities and influences. Matisse cutouts influenced Picasso's sculpture later. How?
Well, Matisse, at the end of his life, because he was bedridden, could no longer draw from the model as easily, invented a new way of making art, which was with scissors and large pieces of paper that he had his assistants color. And in some ways, he went towards Picasso's way of making art in the sense that he thought about reducing the body to what he called a sign. That is, instead of drawing from the living model, to begin to produce these abstractions of dancing figures, acrobatic figures, which were condensed memories of the elasticity, the athleticism of the bodies that he'd studied all of his life. So he began working more from the imagination, and in this combination, almost like sculpting and drawing at the same time, cutting out these figures. He produced anatomies which in some sense recall some of the more surrealist anatomies that Picasso was making already in the 30s. But he produced them in a way that produced a dialogue between positive and negative shape and an authority of simple line that had a profound impact on Picasso when he saw them visiting Matisse at that time. And if you look at the cutout metal sculptures that Picasso did some years later, which in some sense are like origami done with sheet metal, you'll see that the idea of positive-negative shape and of cutting with tin snips looks back to the same kind of technique and the same sense of form that you find in the Matisse cutouts.
Now, what was it exactly that Picasso began doing after 1954 to honor Matisse?
There are several different things. I think Matisse had always had certain signature themes, and one of them was the studio.
Right.
And the empty studio, and especially in his later life, in the 40s, when he was bedridden, he painted the rooms that he lived in as a kind of combination of living environment and studio. And Picasso did, almost immediately after Matisse died, a series of empty studios in the South, which are very much like Matisse's pictures of the 40s, with palm trees outdoors, art inside. They look like they're directly based on the Matisse's. As John mentioned earlier, he began a dialogue with Delacroix's Women of Algiers, and when Roland Penrose said, you know, these paintings after Delacroix look a lot like Matisse, he said, yes, Matisse left me his odalisques and I'm carrying on his work. And that whole interest in Delacroix and North African exoticism, which had really been Matisse's terrain, was something Picasso picked up. I think everyone who talked to Picasso and everyone who knew him felt that he was profoundly affected by the loss of Matisse, and that it continued to reverberate in his art, not only in the first years after the death, but for years thereafter.
Why didn't he go to his funeral?
Picasso hated the idea of death. Why did he never make a will? He never signed a will. He left the most complicated estate you can imagine because of this.
He hated the idea of
He was
death.
Superstitious. He was deeply superstitious. It's said that at a certain point in his life, he used to recite the names of all of his friends every morning so that nothing evil would happen to them. When the family went on a vacation, they had to put the suitcases in the middle of the room and do a certain number of circles around them so that the trip would be under good fortune. He was a very superstitious man, and as a Spaniard, haunted by superstitions of death. And he didn't want to admit it. He didn't want to sign his own will. He never wanted to think about it. And going to a funeral was exactly the kind of thing that would have spooked him. He wouldn't have liked doing.
Yeah, I mean, even more, when the phone call was made to Picasso's house to say Matisse has died, he wouldn't come to the telephone. He didn't want to talk about it. It's recently become clear that one thing that he did do, or rather didn't do, was work. I mean, this was the person who was a compulsive worker, you know, who was painting, working all the time. He was paralyzed by it. For 2 weeks, he couldn't do anything.
He couldn't work.
He couldn't work.
So the impact of his death was so
profound
that he couldn't pick up the
left him,
brush.
you know, artistically bereft, which was what was the most important thing to him.
What do you think was the single most important influence Matisse had on Picasso?
I think being Matisse was the most important thing.
Meaning?
That for Picasso as a young artist to have someone like Matisse there as a constant sounding board. You know, and in the end he said, you know, who else is there but Matisse?
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's also true of the other one.
You know, I know you want to avoid sports metaphors in terms of competition, in terms of a race, in terms of a fight to the end to who is the best. But there is this thing about life and sports. Competition between two warriors brings out the best in both. It does.
Yes.
Larry Bird and Magic Johnson in professional basketball, McEnroe and Borg in tennis, Hogan and Snead in golf. That was true. Even though it wasn't a race, they brought out the best in each other. Yes?
I would agree with that. The difference, of course, is that they were playing an identical game by the same set of rules, so the measurement is easy. Matisse and Picasso often were pursuing different ends in
There's
art.
a way to keep score. There's no way to keep score in art. Right. Yeah. But what then is the same answer to how Matisse influenced Picasso? Or the way Picasso influenced Matisse? In the end, it's the same answer, by being Picasso and by being Matisse.
I think having the presence of another creator who each recognized was of a level of complexity and ambition equal to their own made the world a different place for each of them and made them think of their place in that world differently than if the other person hadn't been there. And I think, you know, there are moments where they drift apart and where they feel the other person isn't there. We've already talked about the 30s, and I think that Yves Bois, the scholar earlier, emphasized the degree in which when Picasso paints those very Matisseian odalisques of the early 30s, they're a critique, in a certain sense, of what had become a certain lassitude or a certain comfortableness in Matisse's art. And by turning up the volume on the color, by wrenching up the structure in the odalisques, as Bois put it, he's saying, come on back out and play. Yeah. Come on, let's get back on the court here. You've been away for a while. Come on back out here, or I'm going to steal your ball from you. You know, and I think there's that.
I will become the greatest unless you get back on the field.
I'm going to take over your territory and plant my flag on your turf unless you get back out here and get in the game with me again. And I think there is some truth to that metaphor, that idea that each of them, though Matisse could call Picasso a bandit, say showing with him is like being shut up with an epileptic, that they, in their heart of hearts, they knew that they had become greater artists by virtue of the presence of the other.
I would only add that clearly we are interested in this exhibition in showing how their work relates. Right. We don't claim, however, that Matisse spent this whole working day thinking about Picasso or Picasso about Matisse. And when you put their work together, you not only see how they relate to each other, but how they don't relate to each other. And there's this whole other world there. And I think that...
but how is that reflected? I mean, that's only reflected in the art that you don't have here.
No, I think it's actually reflected in these, because once you see the comparison, you see, yes, that looks like that, and then as you look at it, you see, but actually it doesn't look like that. They drift close, they drift apart. You see with, very similar pictures how they treat them differently. And in fact, we've tried to calibrate the comparisons through the exhibition. So sometimes we're saying, look how, for example, they treat a studio subject in very different ways. The Matisse in a soft tonal way, which looks back to Corot. The Picasso in a way which looks a bit like Mondrian. That they prize apart, other times they come together.
Well, some will argue, critics will argue, that in order to show this relationship, you're stretching it. Because you look at they painted the same thing, therefore it's a comparison between Matisse and Picasso when it's not. Tell me if that's relevant. Do you think?
It's very relevant, because when we were putting together the groupings and the pairs, we decided if it's simply the same subject treated by them both, it's not going to be enough. If it's simply them both using the same colors, same shapes, it's not going to be enough. We needed something where either there was actually a historically documented relationship, where we knew that Picasso had seen this, Matisse had seen that, where there was a link of technique, where there was enough accumulated similarities and differences to work. It's like rules of evidence. One wasn't enough. There had to be, three things at least to bring these works together.
You have two sources in journalism before you can go with the story. Kirk, give me...
Well, I also think that the show is conceived in 34 sort of units or chapters, and sometimes the units are just two pictures facing each other, sometimes they're a group of pictures. Sometimes the reason for having that unit together is it's the same year and we know they looked at each other's pictures and they're really immediate reactions. Sometimes it's their consideration of a common theme that they reflected over a long period of years. When we do the sculpture of Picasso in the 30s, we think that Picasso is probably looking at the Matisse sculpture show from the late 20s, which shows the sculpture that Matisse made in the teens reacting to, in part, Picasso's sculpture of 1909, so that there you have a dialogue that stretches over a long period of time. So there's no one principle. The viewer is asked, in fact, to shift gears several times within the show to reconsider the terms on which the dialogue is done. And sometimes it is a term of clash or opposition within the treatment of the same subject. When we put the two odalisques together in the early 30s, we're putting a beautiful, luscious, very sensual Matisse against a Picasso which is willfully ugly and deforming, because we want to make the point that Picasso is making an aggressive anti-Matisse, that he's making a specific statement in the same format, the nude in the armchair, which had been Matisse's signature, in order purposefully to attack or thumb his nose at Matisse. That's not the same reason that we're putting together portraits in the early part of the show. So we try to cover all the different gamuts, all the different ways in which they related to each other, by clash and opposition, by hostility, by mutual dependence, by borrowing, by reinventing themselves in relation to the other in 34 different installments.
You know what stuns me is that no one has done this. There was something at the Kimball, there was something in 1947 since. These two giants of the 20th century brought together in this extraordinary, you can't sit here on a Sunday evening and look at these two paintings and not think that you're among the lucky of the world to see side by side two of the greatest cultural figures and artists of the 20th century. I'm amazed it hasn't been done before. Why is that?
It is interesting. We've asked ourselves this. One thing is it's obvious. Another thing is it's not obvious at all.
Yeah.
That as these two artists became famous and became the artists with the reputation they had, it was natural for people to oppose them. And as you know, it's so convenient to do this, to say Matisse is like this, Picasso is like that. And, as Kirk was saying right at the beginning, they are taught separately in the textbooks. Picasso appears in the chapter on Cubism, Matisse appears in the chapter on Fauvism. It requires thinking out of the box to show them together. It also requires the Musée of Modern Art getting together with the Centre Pompidou and the Musée Picasso and the TED.
Two people that had a lot of paintings to put together.
There are 20-plus paintings from the MoMA collection in this exhibition, same rough number from Paris.
Will we see their like again?
Two artists like this, you only get to be a pioneer once, I think. And the combination that they had of being present at the creation of one of the most traumatic breaks in the history of representation. I mean, something that deserves comparison with the invention of perspective and the birth of the Renaissance, the period from 1890 to 1920 in terms of the invention of a new set of arguments and a new set of ways of representing. The two of them are so embedded in that moment of creation, and yet, as John said, so much aware of their place in a larger artistic tradition. That combination of being a radical revolutionary and feeling at the same time one's link to the great artists of the past is something that was a field of possibilities open to them at that moment. It's hard to recreate, hard to think of how that opportunity exists in similar balance for another artist after them.
Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Kirk.
Matisse Picasso runs through May 19th at the Museum of Modern Art, Queens. We thank you for joining us for this hour, and we hope to see you next time. Good night.